George was one of my closest friends. I had the privilege to say the following words to George directly and personally on July 6th, as he was about to be transferred from the neuro to his home for the final time. Our conversation was literally interrupted by the transport coming to take him. And at that time, on that day, it was hard for George to speak, but his mind was razor sharp. Over 21 years ago, I came for the first time to Montreal. It was the first time I'd ever been here. It was in the winter. It was very, very cold. I arrived early in the morning. Joe Weinberger picked me up from the airport and brought me to ADATH. It was just after the morning breakfast had ended. And I sat with George in the Zuckerman Hall. And after a few minutes of pleasantries, it was the first time we were ever meeting, he took my hand in his and he held it tight. And he started talking to me very loudly and very fast. And I was enthralled by his personality and by the vision of ADATH he articulated and by the prospect of being George's partner in working on that vision, and by the honor of being enlisted into that partnership. Whatever I have accomplished in Montreal, George and I accomplished together. And he remained a true friend of mine, especially when he privately and lovingly and bluntly told me that I had made a mistake. I appreciated that more than anything. As you heard, everything George did for his family, for ADATH, for the Jewish Rehab and other organizations, for his business, he did with a full heart, full energy, full persistence, and full confidence. George always told me stories about his children, how much he learned from them, which is true. But George was a role model to them and to our community. 7 years ago, George told me this story on his father's yahrzeit. When his father was 49 years old, he suffered his first heart attack, and he was confined to home for the last 10 years of his life. He passed away at the age of 59. All of his life before that had been a life that was vibrant, alive, and for the last 10 years, he suffered with a very, very low quality of life. George told me he was once in Toronto during that time, and he saw a paint by numbers kit, and he bought it. And he came home and he went to his father, and he said to his father, "Gloria and I want a painting for our home, but we can't afford it. So would you please help us by painting a painting for us with this kit?" And his father started painting. And he did one painting, and then another, and he did many of those paintings. And it gave George's father a lot of satisfaction that he otherwise would not have had in his last years. And George told me it was the biggest mitzvah of my life. In 2008, there was a tribute to George at the Jewish Rehab Hospital. I heard this story then. George was the president of Jewish Rehab, and the government said they had to cut funding. And a provincial minister came to meet with the board. And at that meeting, George said to the minister, "We can't do it with less funds. If you cut the funds, we give up. You run the hospital." And he took the keys out of his pocket and he threw them across the table. And he said, "Here, you take the keys. You run the hospital." Minister said, No, we'll find a way," which they did. After the minister left, the other board members said to George, "What did you do? And how did you get the keys to the hospital?" George said, "What do you mean? They're my house keys. Don't tell anyone." On George's 89th birthday, 2021, he told me, he said, "The doctor said to me, 'You're already living longer than I originally told you.'" This was a year and a half ago. The doctor said, "You're on God's time now." And George added, "I have enough emunah, belief in God, trust in God, to feel I am grateful for every day. And when the guy upstairs is ready for me, I'm ready to go." It was exactly 1 year later, on his 90th birthday, this past May. I visited George in the Jewish General Hospital emergency room, and he told me privately that he had an inoperable brain tumor. And George knew what that meant. He knew what was going to happen. And he said to me, "I am not in pain. I have bitachon, trust in God. I'm not worried. And I'm not afraid. My life is filled with a beautiful marriage, wonderful children, nachas, Torah. My only fear is Gloria's well-being." David HaMelech, King David, wrote in Tehillim Psalms the famous line, "Gam ki elech begates al moves," even though I walk through the valley of shadow of death, lo ira ra, I fear no evil, ki ata imadi, because you, God, are with me. David wrote that. George lived it. And of course, it was George's outlook and George's character, but it was also, perhaps more so, George's family. George and Gloria, for 69 years, treated each other with love and tenderness and respect, each holding the other as the focal point of their lives in a way that was and is magnificent and inspiring for all of us to see and witness. And George, as I said, constantly told me stories about each of his 4 children. Amazing stories about his children and their spouses and how much he learns from them, how blessed he feels. And in particular, he pointed out to me the acts of kindness, putting themselves out for others without attracting attention to themselves, doing it quietly. And he told me about each of his grandchildren. Each of you must know how much nachas you gave George, how much you contributed to his gratitude and trust in God, how you helped him prepare for this last sad but awe-inspiring chapter of his life. The Rav Yosef Soloveitchik, wrote, "What is the most important thing in life?" He wrote that he learned the most important thing in life from his mother. The Rav said, the most important thing in life is to feel the presence of the Almighty and the gentle pressure of his hand upon my frail shoulders. George felt that. George lived that. And you, every member of his family, played a giant role in giving that to him. George's passing leaves a hole in his family, a hole in ADATH, a hole in our community that cannot be filled. His judgment, his wisdom, his energy in tackling missions, large and small. ADATH is not the same without George. Gloria and her family are not the same without George. But we have the stories. And we will never forget what George taught us and what George would want us to do. Would you please stand?
Shechina b'malois kedov boishim utzahoirim kezohar es nishmas Gershon Eliyahu ben Rabbi Shua Tzvi שהולך לעולמוי בבור שבני משפחתוי מתפללים לעילוי נשמתוי בגן עדן תהי מנוחתוי לכן באו לו רחמים יסתירהו בססר כנפיו לעולמים ויצרו עיר ויצרו החיים אס נשמו בבוסוי אדינוי הוא נחלו בבוסוי וינוח בשלום על משכבוי ונוימה